Welcome, listeners, to episode 4 of the I Heart 90s History podcast, where we explore how historians study the 1990s. I'm Ben Waterhouse from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill.
And I'm Lee Vinsel at Virginia Tech. In this episode, we chatted with Nelson Lichtenstein, research professor in the Department of History at the University of California at Santa Barbara, where he directed the Center for the Study of Work, Labor, and Democracy for almost 20 years.
So we were excited to talk to Nelson not only for his vast expertise in American political and labor history, but especially for his take on the presidency of Bill Clinton. Now, listeners may be familiar with Lichtenstein's long bibliography, which includes books on the labor leader Walter Reuther and the American labor movement, as well as a great book on Walmart and the global economy. And we get into a lot of that in our conversation. But Nelson was especially great to talk to because of his most recent book, which is called A Fabulous Failure: The Clinton Presidency and the Transformation of American Capitalism, which he co-authored with the late Judith Stein and which was published in 2023.
In that book, Nelson paints a picture of Clinton as a deeply conflicted president. He is torn over what paths to take and how to manage the constant infighting among his advisors. In my view, this gives us the richest and fullest historical picture yet of the Clinton White House. It's a book that can really provide a model for future historians to build on.
And the conversation also allowed us to go deeper into some of the big themes of this podcast, especially the challenge of putting recent events into their historical context. Nelson, in particular, was able to reflect on his position as someone who was already an established adult and professional historian at the beginning of the Clinton years, and how that position shaped his understanding of the historical phenomenon of neoliberalism, which is at the heart of his book.
Our producer, Joe Fort, was also part of the conversation. Joe, what stood out to you about our conversation with Nelson?
Yeah, well, with Nelson, it was another great conversation, and it was more about the Clintons, right? Like, we've been talking, it seems, a lot about the Clintons lately, or like through Al Gore and the Clinton administration, but I don't know, some listener may be thinking it's enough already with the Clintons, but and coming next episode, where we're going to be talking with Lily Geismer, we'll probably talk more about the Clintons. But I feel like these guests are bringing distinct perspectives on that are generational and theme specific, that open different and interesting windows using the Clintons as a sort of a vehicle to get there. And I liked the way Nelson connected the themes he's talking about in terms of neoliberalism and how the Clinton White House operated with broader trends like consumerism, big box consumerism, and globalization through NAFTA, and complicating these things. And I want to say, as a kind of side point, that during this interview, we're talking, I forget why, but Nelson somehow made me think of the sort of cultural perception of hope that accompanied the Clintons as they entered the White House. And I referenced an LA Law episode that I thought illustrated this for me as a younger person in mainstream culture. And I want to say that since then, I've been watching LA Law, and I'm on like season 4 now.
Oh, nice.
It starts in 80, like I think we've just passed the 88 election in the world of the show. So it starts in the late 80s and comes in through the 90s. The episode I referenced was 92 or 93 or something like that. After looking it up, I found that out. And I'm also realizing that a lot of my watching right now is 90s. Like, I've been also rewatching Voyager in the Star Trek universe, and X-Files, and one of the things that's becoming apparent to me in all these shows is just the role that material culture is playing in sort of like shaping my nostalgia, my memory, my conception of what has changed. And there's something about like material culture and the sophistication of thought. And there's so many ways in which these shows I'm finding it interesting to see how these shows are both dated and just an artifact of ancient history, but also if I can place myself back in that time ahead of their time, it's just such a rich landscape, and I hope that this podcast takes us deeply into that landscape at some point as we evolve.
Yeah, it's a really good point. It's a really good point about, also for historians to realize just how much we have to work with when it comes to seeing the intersection of mass media, consumer culture, material culture, and things like that as they're kind of filtered through things that we still have ready access to, TV shows and things like that. And so it was kind of in that spirit that we started this podcast or this interview with Nelson, by looking at the intersection of national politics, and particularly the Clinton experience, with popular culture. And so we thought it would be fun to start off by watching a little clip of Bill Clinton himself appearing on, famously, the Arsenio Hall show during the 1992 presidential campaign, and famously playing the saxophone during the introduction of that show. And this led to an introductory conversation with Nelson about what that moment was all about, what it meant for generational politics, what it meant about the role of pop culture in public life, and in particular, what it meant about Bill Clinton's appeal to American voters broadly and to African-American voters in particular.
And let me say, before we go to that clip and open the show, that as I was contemplating popular culture and its role, and placing myself back in the Joe that watched that LA Law episode originally, it was at that time, like I've described it a couple of times in this podcast as like I was in the middle of a political awakening, like becoming aware of politics and stuff. But when I think about it, it's more than that, because it's also, I'm letting go of, at that point, this notion that mainstream culture and mainstream opinion has authority and something to say, right? At that point, like, I was letting go of that and saying, and increasingly thinking of that as some sort of lie that's being, like, that's some sort of fake sort of narrative that's being spun. But I've since come full circle on that now, and seeing the value of what mainstream culture is offering, what people believe, regardless of how true or false it is, what the stories are that we're telling each other in that time, are starting to feel, to me, to be the most significant thing about a period we're studying, especially in the way we're attempting to look at the 90s through the lens of nostalgia and memory and a period that we lived through.
Joe, I think you're like perfect. You might even be secretly lobbying for us to turn to Gen X after we finish up with the Clintons, because I think that would be the perfect pop cultural moment. So why don't we kick it over to a very Gen X moment of Bill Clinton showing up on the Arsenio Hall show and see what happens from there. Yeah, just go. Yeah, no, just play it. He'll figure it out. so cool, man.
I always thought he'd be better.
The shades are incredible. Oh, man. Wonderful. So, Nelson, that clip of Clinton playing sax on the Arsenio Hall show, that was shot on June 3rd, or it was released, it was put out on June 3rd, 1992. So just to start off, where were you professionally and personally in June of 1992 when that was going on?
I was at the University of Virginia.
Okay.
I was, I was there, and I was working on a biography of the labor leader Walter Reuther. And I was about to go to Finland. Well, that we would, and actually, no, we would go the next year to Finland, which was interesting. It plays a role in the work I did on Clinton. I'll tell you later on. For a year as a Fulbright, and I was engaged. I was very engaged and viewed Clinton and the campaign. As we had 12 years of Reagan and H.W. Bush, and Clinton. He's playing the saxophone. I mean, he was not an older generation. I mean, he was, nope. And that was impressive. And he also, people said of him, he's the very comfortable with African American culture, and he was. It's interesting. Despite and in fact, he did make moves to criticize and separate himself from some of the more radical voices. The Sister Soldier kind of incident where he attacks a black activist, and then he, some things on criminal, reform. But nevertheless, he was very comfortable with African Americans, and he had a great deal of support from African Americans, and then the sax, he was making a little break there. It was a generational break, and that can't be denied, in terms of this, American politics, vote getting, et cetera,
Yeah. I remember, my parents were Republicans, so it wouldn't have been them, but I remember that they were at that time, I should be clear. My dad's a friggin' like Bernie bro at this time, so they switched later. But at that point, they were, true red Republicans, I guess, and so they wouldn't have been talking about it. But I remember other people, like my friend's dad, saying like Clinton was cool, and he was about that age too. Like he actually thought. Joe, how about you?
Yeah, the cool, the young, the whole thing. I mean, personally, I was 92 June. I was somewhere out of college just recently, and I either may have moved to California or was just about to move to California, and that's sort of relevant because living out there in LA. People would come to visit, and we'd do touristy things, and I would take them to the Jay Leno show taping or the Arsenio Hall show taping. And I remember how big it was, and I remember being turned away at the Arsenio Hall studio because they already had the audience at capacity. And so I remember that show being big. I remember it being a big thing that there was a mainstream talk show with a black host, right? And folks talking about Clinton being the youngest president after he's become like the youngest president in a long time. The first time a president is younger than me, my parents are saying. The first time a president is younger than Mick Jagger, heard people say. And, so that whole thing. And I remember I wasn't a Clinton supporter. There was a few Democrats I favored above him, right? In that run. But I was in the midst of a political awakening, and I did mark the sort of importance of this generational shift, and that all did seem cool to me at the time. I mean, he's kind of nailing it for what you might expect, right? So yeah, those are my impressions and memories sort of mixed up.
Yeah.
I think there's a couple of things that we can say to kind of situate this in time. I mean, as you point out, he was young. He was, I just did the math. He was 45. So
younger than me at this point. Dear Lord.
Yeah, he's younger than me as well. That's young for a politician. It's certainly young by the standards of the gerontocracy that we've sort of moved into in the last couple of decades. He turned 46 later that summer. So yeah, when he was elected, he was one of the youngest, not the youngest. And Arsenio's show, as you point out, was also like geared toward younger adults, but not young adults. I would say, like it was sort of geared toward. I would guess like that kind of older Gen X, maybe young boomer type thing. It wasn't the kind of thing that 45-year-olds necessarily watched a lot. It was the kind of thing that 30-year-olds might have watched. And we were doing some research on that clip and realized that this particular clip happened just a couple of months after Johnny Carson stepped down as the host of The Tonight Show. So there's a sort of feeling that
the generational shift there too.
Yeah, a younger African-American comedy icon. I mean, Arsenio had done all those movies in the 80s. As the host of a late night show, was kind of clawing it away from the kind of staid old white man comic that Carson represented. Ironically, that didn't last, right? And then late night goes back to being the preserve of older white guys talking to boomers as they're falling to sleep.
So, Ben, you got this theory about about generational stuff in historiography.
Yeah, well, I wanted to ask Nelson about this in particular because I also experienced the Clinton campaign and presidency from the perspective of a kid. I was, I think, in 8th grade at the spring of 1992, and my parents had a particular view of Clinton that I think in many ways came out of their generational framing. And I remember this in my mother in particular, who was a couple of years younger than Clinton, and kind of a professional. She thought of herself as a feminist, but very, more of a corporate feminist kind of professional woman with a college education, who had not been part of the radical 60s and saw in Clinton, I think, something that she was uneasy with. And I do think, honestly, part of it was a lack of a willingness to concede that somebody younger than her could actually be president. And so I've sort of extrapolated from this a general theory of baby boomer self-loathing that, while he was very popular among people of that generation, a little bit older than him and a little bit younger than him, there was, I think, also a little bit of a pushback, not necessarily from dyed-in-the-wool conservatives, but from people who weren't totally okay with a young person usurping, in this case, the presidency from somebody who was much more of that sort of World War II generation. So, Nelson, given your studies of the campaign and the Clinton presidency, I wonder what you make of my theory.
Yeah, a couple of things. Let me say, we'll probably can return to this issue, but I just want to get this out, and then I'll get specifically to your question. That there, I think there has settled, and sometimes these sort of historiographic kind of things that sort of settle on the past. It's really hard to be revisionist about it. But I think the dominant theme about Clinton these days is he's a neoliberal, and that's what he was, and he walks in the White House as a neoliberal, and that's sort of it.
Yeah.
My book doesn't say that. It makes him to the left of that to begin with. He becomes that, but I think part of the interest in the campaign, the excitement was that he said many different things, often controversial, but he was, in fact, it wasn't just his youth. He was actually had ideas and conceptions that were very, well, kind of an almost industrial policy, and some things, some echoes of what are prequels to what some of the sort of moderate left would be doing today. So I just want to get that out. We could come back to that. I do think I do think that Clinton is a lightning rod for conservatives, certainly, and many of those who had been kind of more committed new leftist types, And he had been he had been against the war. He had the whole draft issue, which was really such a lightning rod for the right. It's complicated. He asked for a deferment, and then anyway, it got complicated. I mean, but lots of people, including me, including my generation, were complicated on this draft, on the draft, getting out of the draft.
Well, he hadn't served, right, and that was relevant in '92. He hadn't served in the military, and that was unique among presidents.
Yeah, no, right, right. That was a new thing. Yes, that at the time was considered. Oh, wow, Of course, Reagan had not served, but he'd been making films for the military.
That was fine.
Anyway, so that was, and I remember it's funny. I was watching, actually, Robin Kelly, a well-known historian, we were sitting watching TV in my house sometime in probably the fall of 1992, and one after another, a veteran of the Vietnam War who were very conservative were getting up there and telling war stories, basically about what they had done in Vietnam. And basically the point was Clinton hadn't been there. It was really, it was tough. And there was that. So that was a sense. And I do think that the sort of atmospherics of the persona, that does become important in terms of voting. Voting, even though historians may see this as sort of fluff, but questions of who's going to vote, and votes count. So Clinton had a complicated and somewhat attractive and often repulsive, kind of persona that would always be there with him.
Yeah.
Well, and then years, like it was kind of a dress rehearsal for 12 years later with the Swift Boat Veterans for Truth against John Kerry.
All of that. You could just sort of conjure it up, you sort of make it up, and sometimes it sticks, and sometimes it doesn't stick, and things kind of, I think Clinton had a little Teflon flavor to him. The right never forgot anything, but the kind of the general Democrats gave him a lot of forgiveness, and Hillary, stuck by his side in all. Today, the infidelities of Clinton seem so. They're there unquestionably, but given the contemporary world, they seem kind of ordinary. But anyway, that was a big deal with Hillary, and Hillary stuck by her man, for which the right never forgave her.
Right. Well, there's a fascinating question there in sort of presidential history of the last, 40, 50 years about like what is considered scandalous, what's considered like a career ender. You mentioned the infidelities, and that was a big deal. Not that other presidents hadn't cheated, but that it was always sort of kept under wraps. And then, of course, that ultimately leads to Clinton's impeachment trial. But the other issue that I remember was the issue of drug use. And how it was absolutely unthinkable that a president of the United States could ever... Right. And therefore you get the whole I tried it, I didn't like it, I didn't inhale. And people said, no, that's not how that works, Bill. But today, and ever since, we have pretty much, it's openly accepted that recent presidents have used drugs recreationally. And, so there were all these sort of changes that I don't know if they intersect directly with this generational change with this first baby boomer president, first of a long line now. But all these things that seem to be quite unique in the early 90s seem not to be anyway. Well, we could maybe get more specific, Nelson. You referenced a few places where we can kind of get into the meat of this history, and I wanted to preface that by referencing your career as a historian and the many fascinating and important books that you've written that range from, as you mentioned, the book on Reuther and labor to intellectual histories, to this great book on Walmart and globalization that came out around 15 years ago, to now the book that you published most recently, A Fabulous Failure: The Clinton Presidency and the Transformation of American Capitalism. So maybe to start, could you take us through a little bit of the process of how that book came into being? How does a labor historian end up writing a Clinton book?
Well, in general, and this, I think all labor historians, I think, sort of move to a degree in this direction. we move into the history of capitalism. I mean, it's just inevitable. You can't not. You can't do one without the other. You just can't. And I did that with the writing about Walmart, but even before that, I had to look into what is General Motors? What is, how do, when I'm writing about auto and auto unions. So I found myself doing that. And I just want to make one thing. So in 1993, okay, long before, I'm in Finland. And I would every other day I'd walk over to the American, what was it called, the reading room of the American Information Office. It was a function of, I don't know, the Voice of America or anyway. And I would read the New York Times. They weren't online then. And in the fall of '93 was when the big debate over healthcare was happening. And as I was reading these long, detailed articles, I read every detail. It struck me. I was working then on the 30s, but I thought I was getting an X-ray into the political economy of the United States through the debate on healthcare, and I just got fascinated with that, and I sort of kept up with that. And in the Clinton book, you'll notice there are 2 chapters on the healthcare fight, and which I took seriously in terms of then it's really the structure of it is, which sectors of capital were in favor of this social democratic initiative and which ones were against, and then how that reflected in party terms. So I was sort of moving in that direction to a degree. And then what did happen? So Judith Stein, who was a colleague, and we weren't close, but we agreed on some things. She had a contract to write a book on Clinton, and she died. And I wrote an obituary about her, kind of about her work. And I'll get to it. Her agents got in touch with me, I think via Eric Foner. Anyway, and said, "You want to write this book? There's a contract." And I said, "Oh," and I assembled my grad students, who interestingly they all came from labor, but they were doing political economy. And I assembled them, and we discussed this question, whether I should do this book, and et cetera. And I just said I would. She'd done some research and kind of had a proposal, but she hadn't really done much. And actually, it's interesting. I mean, she was most interested in trade questions. That was clearly a big deal.
Sure.
She wasn't interested in healthcare. She wasn't interested in anyway. I won't go into it, but
was she, Nelson? If I can interrupt, was she sort of envisioning this as a follow-on to her pivotal decade book, which did have a lot of trade?
Yes, she was. Yes, she wrote Judith Stein wrote a very important and pioneering book called The Pivotal Decade, and before that a book on steel, which was quite good too.
Amazing book. Yeah.
So anyway, but she hadn't gotten really far, so I said yes, I'll do it, and it's complicated. It didn't end up with the press. Here I have to tell you the story. The word. So I write a new proposal and it goes to various presses, and the word came back: "We don't want this book because American public has Clinton fatigue." That was, I love that. I love that. I said, okay, that's pretty devastating.
This was after 2016, right? After Clinton had lost the election.
It did get published by Princeton, but I think this was. I was setting out the proposal in 2017, I think it was. Okay, that's just after Hillary. Okay. So anyway, the point is, as a labor historian, that was my impulse, and I was a big radical at Berkeley and et cetera when I was in grad school. Labor historians have to be students of political economy, period, and intellectual history, and so that's sort of where I've sort of gravitated. I mean, I still write about labor. My latest book which is coming out in the fall, is on the kind of the new moment of labor. But one has to do this. One has to be cognizant of what's going on in the circulation of capital, and certainly that's. I do think that there was a transformation in the nature of American capitalism during not just Clinton, but in this moment.
Mm-hmm. Can you say so? I love the title, "The Fabulous Failure," because it tells us right away what you think about that presidency. But the failure part, we were, Ben, Joe, and I were talking about it yesterday. It's like failure from whose perspective? And I assumed that it would not be your perspective. But it sounds like you were a little bit more optimistic and hopeful about him initially than I would have expected. Did you?
Yes, and I think rightly so, because
Yeah.
I think, as I said earlier, I think a sort of historiographical blanket has descended over the early Clinton. People like Lily Geismer and others, and they're good historians, but I think a sense of inevitability and a kind of implicit
Yeah.
neoliberalism that they just walked into the White House with, and I think an overemphasis on the role of the Democratic Leadership Council, which, I mean, it does become important, but I think not initially. So yes, I do remember, for example, in the fall of '92, a panel that we had at Virginia, which had Richard Rorty on it and others, and there was a great deal of excitement that Clinton was coming to the fore. And one of the things I emphasize in the book is a big meeting they had at the Little Rock, an economic summit, which brought together, all sorts of kind of, not the left, the extreme, but the left wing of the Democratic Party is there, and they're talking about industrial policy. That's what they're talking about. And that, the market's not going to solve it. Now, as I say, that will change, and part of the book is why that fails. The failure, when it says failure, meaning they tried to do something else and it failed, and the book is really explaining some of that failure and why Clinton ends up in what I do think would be proper to call a sort of neoliberal posture in terms of trade and economic regulation, et cetera.
Yeah, when I talk about your book a lot, Nelson, because I think it's the best treatment of Clinton we have yet, and the reason is because exactly what we're talking about, because you see him for all his complications and tensions and contradictions, right? He's kind of a mess. He's all over the place. He's got advisors who are all over the place politically. But one of the things when I'm trying to tell people why they should read it and get at what you're saying is that he goes in and he's got people on the left, soft left, right? Like Reich and these kind of characters who are want to use state power to do things in the economy, but debt and these kinds of things and worries about budgets and all this kind of stuff, consistently pushes them to, what looks like neoliberal policymaking. Yeah. Is that a fair start?
Yeah. I mean, maybe the listeners know about Reich and people like that, but one person they probably don't know about is Laura Tyson, who came out of the Berkeley Roundtable on international economics. She was very much a kind of a social planning, industrial policy, a kind of a critic of markets, and she flies down to Little Rock to be interviewed as head of the first Council of Economic Advisors. Who were her competitors? Who were the competitors to Laura Tyson? One was Paul Krugman, who at that time was very much a big free trader, and she was not. And the other was Larry Summers, and it wasn't just because she was beautiful, although that was part of it.
Yeah, it was him, right?
But it was because she had a perspective, and she was writing op-eds in the LA Times and the New York Times, which was saying and Japan at that time was we were hysterical about trade with Japan at that moment, and she was saying, look, we have to have managed trade with Japan, and we can't, the market isn't going to do it, and Clinton picks her. Now the Council of Economic Advisors will not be as important as it had once been, but nevertheless, I think that was a symbolic and more than symbolic, indication of where Clinton was moving in that early period.
Yeah. So we hope to have Lily on and some other folks who kind of write about the so-called new Democrats, Atari Democrats, these kind of characters in the 1980s who look kind of neoliberal from very early on, right? In various ways. I mean, whether that's a fair characterization or not is whatever. We'll leave that to the side. But how do you see Clinton as a trying to transition from the 80s to 90s? To what degree is he some carrying on what was already happening in the party in the 80s or not?
Yeah, right. I mean, he was right. He was, I always say he spent 50% more time as governor of Arkansas than in the White House. And Arkansas was, a poor state, and he was trying to basically industrialize it and get better into. He was going all over the world looking for models of what would work in Arkansas. I mean, I mean, it takes more than just importing a model of a factory from northern Italy. It didn't always,
Right.
but he's trying to do that. But at the same time, as the Democratic Party, as Labor becomes weaker, and that had always been a pillar of of a kind of stolid but nevertheless liberal left kind of aspect of the Democratic Party. It was not the labor movement as an idea is at its nadir, absolute nadir in the 1980s and 90s. I mean, just the people who represented it just were not attractive and not exciting
Right.
in any way.
Yeah.
And from Reich and Clinton understood that. I mean, and so Clinton goes to war, for example, with the National Education Association in Arkansas, and so does Hillary. I thought in a very opportunistic way. But they thought, okay, we want to get more money for teachers, which they did, and they actually succeeded. But we're gonna make the NEA a whipping boy, a whipping girl, So that was, there were all sorts of things there that are pretty nasty. He gets to the White House. He does have a more national constituency. Labor is actually stronger, and the left is stronger in terms of the nature of the parties and everything. A figure like Gephardt, who he has to deal with. He's not the Speaker of the House. He's the Majority Leader. Clinton has to deal with them, and so he actually shifts to the left slightly in the first part, but until the 1994 elections, he shifts to the left. The Democratic Leadership Council, I found these memos which are just fascinating, and basically these memos from Al Fromm, he was the head of it, are basically complaining. They're complaining.
Beautiful.
We thought you were our guy. What are you ignoring
Right.
us? You aren't dealing with you brought us to the party, but then you ignored us. I mean, it's really it's very interesting. What was her name? One of the DLC of the. Anyway, the fact that Clinton was very good friends with Marilyn Wright Edelman, who the DLC hated she was the symbol of the welfare state, but Hillary and Bill were very good friends anyway. So in that early period, it's just not the case that he has a worked out ideology, and I think that's important, and that social forces, elections, decisions that are made sometimes incorrectly, just blunders. I call NAFTA a blunder as much as it was a kind of well worked out, ideology. These things, have a huge impact.
So I'm fascinated by the way you frame Clinton's, the tensions and the things pulling him, because it seems to me that there's a parallel in the story you just described between the DLC and what was happening on the other side of the aisle, on the right as well. The way it's often told, particularly by the early 2000s, is that the religious right feeling sold out by the sort of economic right, or the Wall Street view, and that plays out in the 90s. It plays out under the George W. Bush administration, but it's a good reminder for all of us that the way we talk about left and right in American politics is way too oversimplified, whether we're talking about the present day or whether we're talking about sort of historical sweeps and a shift from a sort of New Deal order to a neoliberal order as a shift from left to right. Both of them, both sides have this sort of fragmentation, tension, and much greater variety than a simple version would suggest.
And I got some of this from your book on business, that the business community itself is not monolithic at all in this period.
Sure.
And when the healthcare, I thought, was the best X-ray of this, that you could see different fractions of the business community coming, and Walmart. I mean, the like a lot of American sort of liberals, the image of business in the mind of it's some big factory, some big industrial corporation. No, it's Walmart, it's Pizza Hut, it's these low wage, low benefit retailers, and that's where the division comes down in many ways on the health reform, because the old line industrial companies were more or less comfortable. They were for it, and even the Chamber of Commerce, for a moment, was willing to cut a deal with Clinton. But it's the low wage service sector, fast food,
and the National Federation of Independent Business.
Yeah, small businesses.
Joe, you wanted to get in?
Yeah, I just, as you're talking, Nelson, I'm thinking about the sort of cultural manifestation of this, and this is sort of to the side, but it really speaks to the leftist hope you're connecting to, and the early Clinton. And I'm thinking about this. I don't remember very specifically the characters of this show or what was going on, but L.A. Law, right? The show L.A. Law, and I just quick Google. Brought me to what my memory is digging up is season 7, episode 15, 1993, right? And
Of course.
That one, I got it.
in which a kind of con man, I guess, is how I'm remembering it, brings a case to the firm, and it has connections to the Clinton administration.
Hey.
They just like taken office and started, and Hillary's working on health care, and he's spinning these tales of like being in these rooms late at night, and all of a sudden Hillary says, well, why don't we sue him? Like talking about either the drug companies or the insurance companies or somebody. And like he's bringing this case to these leftist lawyers at this LA firm, and they're like so starstruck, and like that's why they're taken in. And it really illustrated for me and it lives in my memory now as like, yeah, there was this like energy for folks who, when the Clintons took and they were going to take on healthcare, and what people were saying about Hillary Clinton at the time, and how she was going to be a partner in this, and she was being handed healthcare, and I can really like sort of connect to that hope you're talking about, and how distinct it was from the blanket of like they came in as neoliberals, but
But I mean, the reputation of Hillary Clinton is interesting. She, on the one hand, yes, she's clearly a feminist, and that the first lady. She breaks with that for sure. In the kind of tradition of first ladies, and which is returned actually subsequently. So she's very popular. More popular, and she was to the left of Bill Clinton back in the 70s and 80s. She was clearly to the left, but of course there's this enormous reaction against her because she is a feminist, But nevertheless, she stays pretty popular through his through much of his through his term. Toward the end of it, she sort of pulls back because she was burned by the failure of healthcare. But even then later on, she has a new lease on life as a popular figure when she's a senator, and when she's a Secretary of State, she's very popular. But at the instant she declares for the presidency in, like, I guess 2015, I mean, her popularity declines radically, and women in power. It's uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable in America.
Yeah.
But yeah. But by the way, the other Hollywood production is The West Wing. That's all about the Clintons, and that's sort of I watch. It's kind of power. They're trying to do good things, but then often real kind of realpolitik comes in. That's really the tension in The West Wing. I think it does capture a bit of that, of the Clinton persona, the Clinton moment.
Absolutely. I'm rewatching that right now.
Yeah.
I'm in the
Well,
midst
before
of it.
there was The West Wing, there was The American President, which was sort of the movie that with Annette Bening,
the rom-com.
Yeah. And Martin Sheen, right? Who was the president, who then goes on to play the
But the American
Chief of
president
Staff
was
in the
Michael
TV show.
Douglas, right?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm back. Yeah, Martin Sheen played the chief of staff in the movie, and then the president on the
That's
TV
right.
show.
I didn't remember that.
Yeah, but they weren't identical, but they were very much related, and it's the same thing. So if a viewer wants a 90-minute version of it rather than watching all the full run of The West Wing, An American President or The American President captures exactly this. It's like the hopes and dreams of the kind of liberal elite, American political world. And what Clinton could have been, might have been, but instead we ended up with primary colors.
So Nelson, we wanted to be sure to hit a couple themes about 90s history and how to think about the 90s, including Clinton, but separate from it too. And one place we wanted to start was thinking about the connection between your Clinton book and your Walmart book.
Well, yeah, yeah. Yeah, I mean, yeah, no, I mean, I just think, okay, the 90s.
Yeah.
In 1995, two revelations took place. One, the editors of Fortune decided, hey, there are these retailers out there. I think we should put them on the Fortune list of 500 most important companies. And it turned out Walmart popped up number 4,
Wow.
and Sears number 8 or something, or maybe, and then within 2 or 3 years, Walmart is the biggest corporation in America, as the Fortune editors would define it. I mean, these companies were considered, marginal, even though they were big. But it was, there was this ideological sense that the industrial, corporations were at the heart. I mean, that idea. And by the way, I've always wanted to study the commanding heights of capitalism. That's why I studied General Motors and Reuther to begin with. And then later on, okay, what's the commanding heights? Walmart, And the second revelation was me. I mean, that I'm writing the textbook, Who Built America, which Herbert Gutman had originally founded, and, a bunch of, and I'm writing in the later chapters, and of course, I spent a lot of time talking about auto and steel, but then it dawns on me in this edition we're putting out toward the end of the 90s. Hey, I better start talking about Walmart and Kmart and these
Target,
employing millions of people. They have sales, etc. And of course, also they aren't New Deal creations. I mean, Walmart's from Northwest Arkansas. The New Deal bypassed it. The feminist movement bypassed it. The civil rights movement bypassed it. I mean, it's a different world, and it's I mean, at various moments it was. By the way, it began, had a kind of evangelical flavor to it. As it expanded across the country and then went into other countries, it dropped that actually. But nevertheless, it was a model of a low wage, low benefit. Kind of company, and then that plays into many of the regulatory issues, and especially healthcare, in terms of they would have to pay, these companies like Walmart would have to be taxed, relatively speaking, more heavily than the General Motors or the Chryslers when it came to certain kinds of benefits. So anyway, and they begin to play their weight in American politics is there, and it increases. Now today, to a degree, Walmart has been not displaced. It kind of Amazon obviously occupies some of the same territory that Walmart did, but really Amazon has the business. Once you
Totally.
get beyond the click when you're ordering it, the business model, supply chains, distribution centers, kind of low wages, low benefits. It's sort of the same. It's partly the same. Once you get past the initial way that you buy it. But I think American historians have had it's taken decades to come to terms with the fact that we have that kind of that industry is very important. Now, of course, also today we have Silicon Valley, which is a bit of a different story, and that's another. But I think the whole retail service is still employing far more people than Silicon Valley, and the fact that it's unorganized, and of course they're viciously anti-union, is not an accident, comrade. It's not.
Yeah, nice.
So is that where the identity shifts, like the American identity from like a worker in a factory to a consumer?
Well, no, I know. See, I know the thing on consumption. No, I've never, going way back in my entire career, I've never thought that the identity of working class Americans, we're consuming, so we don't care what's happening in the factory or at the work. We don't care. We're as long as our wages are enough, I'll buy this TV and I'll buy this and that. I've never thought there was that sort of substitution, and I think studies of Detroit auto workers have shown that they were pissed off on the job. They also wanted the color TV. That you can do both. You can have both, and I think that's true. And the same is true with Walmart does have low prices. It is true that the amount of money that the average family spends, say, on home kitchen appliances and T-shirts and clothing, has declined
Oh
relative
yeah.
to total income over the last 40, 50 years. But the amount of money they have to spend for healthcare,
Right.
education, cars, that hasn't declined, and the only higher wages can buy that stuff. So I mean, Walmart advertises this all the time. That we're saving you money. By the way, the other thing, in the heyday of Walmart's supremacy, which is about 15 years ago. And I wrote a book about it, and I had conferences on it, and et cetera. The advertisements you saw by Walmart on TV were not about the product. They were about, you can make good money at Walmart. You can get good benefits. You can become a manager. It was all about the
Yeah.
work, because they were being attacked for that. And today, the advertisements that Amazon puts on TV are the same.
Mhm.
Work for Amazon. You'll make money. Maybe you become a manager, et cetera.
Yeah. And the other thing I wanted to connect it to, and it's just, when I think of Walmart or Target or any of these big box stores, I think of, or Amazon, right? I think of kind of imported cheap stuff, right? And so in the 90s seems like a really important transition moment in terms, I mean, obviously globalization and imports had already been a thing for a long time, especially since the 70s, but it seems like the 90s, it took off even more. And so how do you connect that Walmart story to like NAFTA and trade stories during
Yeah,
that
yeah.
time?
Well, I mean, the Walmart wasn't that important with NAFTA, by the way, which was I consider a blunder, because it was a H.W. Bush project. It had been negotiated mainly by him. It was not something that Clinton had to do. He did it because he was looking for something bipartisan, and this seemed right there. But anyway, but while NAFTA, in terms of economic terms, was not nearly as important as China, in the 90s at least, and actually subsequently, it had a huge political toxic impact. And a number of historians and sociologists have studied the both in terms of voting and in terms of the moment that the South turns from, where the majority of the representatives in the South become Republican, is in the '94 election, and NAFTA has a huge amount to do with that. The sort of so-called conservative Democrats, the blue dog Democrats, are wiped out by NAFTA. Again, it would not have a huge impact right away. But actually, its biggest impact, I think, was less the cheap Mexican goods flooding, but it was the fact that cheap American agricultural products flooded Mexico, destroying the livelihoods of 5 or 10 million Mexican peasants and small farmers, who then either fled to Mexico City or to the border. I mean, that's what was happening when
Oh,
California
fascinating.
can send cheap corn and rice and beans to Mexico and wipe out that's part of the story of NAFTA as well. But when it comes to industrial production, China is much more important.
Yeah.
And there, I mean, Lee and I have talked about this in the past. I mean, there was a kind of sense, globalization's inevitable. Globalization of trade is going to lead everyone to become a kind of a free market, a free speech, free press, sort of technologically advanced kind of society. That China and the U.S. would, if they had free trade, would sort of become this, increasingly look the same. And the Clinton people had that ideology very strongly. And they put many struggles actually to put into effect the opening to China. It would have its biggest impact after Clinton left office, but it was there. It was unquestionably there. Yeah, yeah, yeah. 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 Yeah, Gene Sperling, who's a smart guy, and I'm sure thinks himself as a liberal. He wrote a book called The Pro-Growth Progressive, which came out in like this, his after 2003 or four. And later on, Sperling was in the Biden administration as well. But I mean, he was complete. I mean, he was going on in his book memoir, and he'll talk about all the welfare state things that he was in favor of. But when it came to trade, which he was really a tough, pushing through, getting China in the WTO and opening it up. And also, Sperling also played a big role in the deregulation of derivatives. I mean, the, those were the predicates for the destruction of the welfare state in America. But he doesn't talk about that. He doesn't talk about that at all in his memoir. And the same is true of Robert Rubin, who I do think is the consummate neoliberal. Rubin is a welfare state liberal. His mother, Robert Rubin's mother, voted for Henry Wallace in 1948. She was a civil rights activist. Robert Rubin voted for and gave money for George McGovern in 1972. He is the one reason that he was influential was he's on our side. He was against Clinton's welfare reform because he thought capitalism is chaotic and some people don't always benefit from it.
Yeah.
But for Robert Rubin, the most important thing was the unfettered mobility of capital. That he wanted, and I think that whether the mobility is abroad to South Korea or wherever, or it's kind of transmutation into various kinds of derivatives and other financial products, those things completely undercut and subvert any kind of welfare state that he was also in favor of. I mean, there's a contradiction there. But it also explains why Rubin was popular, why he remained popular for all throughout the entire period.
Yeah. Well, Ben, what do you want to talk about next? I mean, we got a couple things, but we don't have too much time. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, when Clinton and Robert Reich and Magaziner and others wrote Clinton's sort of putting people first, his sort of manifesto, and the phrase ending welfare as we know it appears there. It did come out of the DLC to a degree. But it was purposely ambiguous. What does that mean? And the sort of the moderate left, the Marilyn Wright Edelman and her husband, I think Peter Edelman, who they thought, well, what that means is we're going to have universal child care. We're going to have a kind of road to retraining, etc. And it would cost money. And
Julius William Wilson. Oh,
William Wilson, who is the African American sociologist from Chicago, who wrote books about the fact that the black family is falling apart because young black men don't have jobs. Clinton loved the work of William Julius Wilson, and Wilson reciprocated. He in the '92 campaign and afterwards, he's citing Wilson. So that was part of Clinton's view. Now, on the other hand, ending welfare as we know it could also mean just cutting people off and appeal to the right. So I mean. When Clinton loses in '94 the election, the midterm election, he's convinced by various types of the DLC becomes more important, becomes more influential after the election of '94. Said, okay, you got to go, you got to have a welfare reform. You got to do it if you want to win in '96. And he's willing to favor and push for a much harsher welfare bill than he would have had, and that's the only bill that people resign on. People resign from the Clinton administration. Some of them do. The Peter Edelman does, and others, a few others, when Clinton goes through with that. But he's an opportunist. He is an opportunist. By the way, the phrase opportunist came out of the French history after the Commune, and one of the ex-socialists said, "Je suis un opportuniste," meaning sort of I look around and I see what can be done, and I go for it. I mean, it's not really a bad word, but Clinton was an opportunist, and he said, "I want to win in '96." And who was that horrible? I forgot his name. The horrible advisor he had, who later got he's now a Republican, and what was his name? Anyway. Yeah, Dick Morris. Thank you very much, Dick Morris. Dick Morris tells you gotta do this. So he does that, and but his reputation is on the left is heavily tarnished by this welfare reform, no doubt about it.
Well, one thing I've noticed, Nelson, and I'm this will probably be in the book I'm writing about. I mean, I'm still working through it and looking at the data, but I think so much of our history, all of that welfare reform moment in the 90s is kind of colored by the initial left reaction to it by journalists and academic left people who are rightly, I'm not saying they shouldn't have been critical of it. It was very bad in a lot of ways. But actually, you see these New York Times, there was a New York Times did a series on how childhood poverty has been reduced from by 60% since the 1990s. And it has to do with tax transfers and all these other things. So I think there is an interesting way in which the initial highly negative reaction to his move there kind of blinded people to the actual material changes that were happening around these issues.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, one thing was there was a kind of boom in the late '90s, and so in fact, there were jobs available. That's one thing. Secondly, EITC, Earned Income Tax Credit. The Clintons were very big on that, and they increased that a tremendous amount, and that was quite helpful. The minimum wage did go up, not very much, but it went up a bit. And then the other thing, which actually was Paul Starr, his work showed me this. After the failure of the health care bill, the Medicaid, which had always been viewed as kind of a welfare side thing, let's get rid of it. That is enhanced first for children, called CHIPS. For every state has and then it just got improved, and then it gets improved again under Obama with his health care plan, and then under Biden it's improved. The Republicans are cutting it back now, but it was improved. So that is a huge kind of subsidy to low wage people. It's universal. It's not targeted, to people who are unemployed or anyway. And I would say more recently the whole welfare. Even that phrase has sort of gone out of use, but we're thinking in much more in universal terms, not just in terms of African American mothers who were unemployed, which frankly was the imagery of that time. I do have to tell you one story. Can I tell you a story about Lewinsky and social policy? Can I tell you that story? So Bill Clinton, he's by the 1997, he is dickering around and negotiating with Newt Gingrich on a variety of things. Newt is the Speaker of the House by that point, and one of the issues is Social Security, and there are secret meetings being held between Larry Summers and I think Dick Armory. He's a big Republican. And they weren't going to completely privatize it, but they were going to begin various little things that would begin the privatization of Social Security. And Clinton thought, Clinton again thinking, I got to do this. I can cut some deals, but let's sort of begin that. Well, the Lewinsky scandal begins in the winter of '98, and it by the end of the summer of '98, Clinton has to admit that he'd had some relationship, and anyway, and then in the House, he is in fact he's impeached. He will be impeached, but okay. So who are Clinton's defenders by the fall of 1998? Who are his defenders? Joe Lieberman? People like that? No. No. The centrist Democrats? No, not at all. His defenders are Barney Frank, who knows something about sex and knows something about finance, and Maxine Walters, who's on the finance. It's the left wing of the Democratic Party who are his defenders during the Lewinsky thing. And at one point, Clinton knows that, and he says at one point, "I guess I've stiffed labor enough," and so he has to drop his negotiating and with the right-wing Republicans on Social Security because he needs the support of the, that's part of the quid pro quo. And he is impeached, but then of course he's not convicted in the Senate. And it was the word Monica Lewinsky saved Social Security. That's part of that's. I have a section there. It's not quite entirely true, but that was the politics of it.
That's a good punchline, Nelson.
He had to Barney. He had to deal with Barney Frank, who
we usually like to end on some kind of like meta questions about the craft of history, and we got a couple. We need to wrap up here, but Ben, we have a couple. What do you want to end with? Totally. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, no, you're right. By the way, we had 10 years ago, had a big conference in Santa Barbara, really revisiting the rise and fall of the New Deal order, and we put out 2 volumes on it, and did also it was also, but but that wasn't the moment. It clearly we didn't quite capture the moment, and so you're right that early volume was very influential, and our later volumes were not. So, but no, you're right. You're right that it's both convenient and easy to stick a name of a president, call it a presidential era, the Reagan era, whatever you want to call it. That's easy, convenient. People sort of know what you're talking about, but maybe it's totally, wrong and puts forward a misinterpretation or a misapplication of your energies or whatever. You're totally right about that. And I felt a little I don't know what. A little. I felt some twinges about it. Having centering Clinton, because you're right, and I think I don't know what I don't know. My solution to that is occasionally we get some concept which transcends, obviously, presidential administrations, transcends, all sorts of things, including wars and such. Neoliberalism is one of them. The welfare state's another one. The African American freedom struggle clearly transcends the feminist movement. So, but you're right, and I don't have a solution to that. I'd welcome yours, but I think that's an issue. I think it's an issue, and of course we fall into it. And by the way, of course, it's just a fact a president cannot in fact be responsible for the ups and downs of the economy during any. It just doesn't happen.
Well, I mean, I think that really comes out in your bio in the book, Nelson, because it's just. I mean, the way I talk about it is so often, and I think there are literatures in this in political science and other, and in kind of like public administration and stuff, that so much of what leaders do in these positions is react to shit they could not foresee that just pops up and is in their face, right? I mean, we're very cognitively limited creatures. We don't understand everything happening in the world. And so the idea that we're all in control of the situation or something is just a total myth, right? Oh, yeah, please do.
Right. Yeah. Right. Yeah.
Yeah, that's
Right.
Beautiful.
Yeah,
And maybe,
they were out of the bond vigilantes, and that was a big issue, and actually, Greenspan and at that time said you gotta reduce the deficit, because only then will the bond traders buy. I mean, whether that was true or not, who knew? But that was what he said. Yeah. Right.
Well, I think that's a great place to wrap up. Nelson, thanks so much for coming and hanging out with us. This was a lot of fun. And we will mention more than once that your Clinton book is out in paperback, and that you got a new book coming out this fall. And what's the title again?
The title is Why Labor Unions Matter. It's in a Yale series called Why X Matters. Anyway, so it's called Why Labor Unions Matter. And the part of it is myself, now in my early 80s, interviewing 25-year-old coffee shop workers and finding what they're thinking about.
That's so great. Well, thank you, Nelson.
You're welcome.
Well, that's the 411 home slice. For us, this has been all that and a bag of chips. Word? Word. Mad props for today's guests and contributors, and for all of the hands that helped to make this episode a thing. Our hosts have been Ben Waterhouse of UNC Chapel Hill and Lee Vinsel of Virginia Tech. The show is created in cloud spaces across the ether, but is anchored right here in the Newman Library Athenaeum on the Blacksburg campus of Virginia Tech. The whole thing chillaxes under the auspices of Virginia Tech Publishing and Press, and the New Books Network distributes our show to all of the places you'll find your podcasts. Along with myself, J.M. Lamb and Graham Conway are editors. Sarah Beatty built the art and animation any YouTube listeners may encounter. I am producer Joe Fort. And this has been the iHeart 90s History Podcast. As a final note, I'd like to say that our deepest and most earnest gratitude has been reserved for you, our dear listener. Thank you very much for listening. Peace out.